Well, before I get started, let me thank Ambassador Meir Rosen, who really has been instrumental in helping the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs over the last number of years with some of our most important projects, in particular our project on defensible borders for Israel, which we've now published in several languages. And second of all, of course, our attempt to clarify to the international community that Ahmadinejad's statements on wiping Israel off the map amount to a violation of Article 3 of the Genocide Convention. Without your input and leadership on a lot of these projects, they really would not have gotten off the ground, and that's why I'll turn to you and ask you to introduce the book, because we've been working together. I hope we work together many years in the future. Many of you might ask yourselves why I wrote a book called The Fight for Jerusalem at this point in time. You know, if you think about it, Jerusalem doesn't seem to be on the negotiating agenda. We are not in the middle of planning for a new Camp David in Washington. Right now, Hamas is in power in the Palestinian Authority. So perhaps a book called The Fight for Jerusalem might seem to some people to be a bit alarmist or maybe premature. But I would contend, and this is the reason why I wrote the book, that there are many undercurrents today that we don't always see. They're not always visible. And that the fight for Jerusalem is already underway. Sometimes it pops up, very briefly, locally. We all remember just a few months ago the struggle over the issue of the Mughrabi Gate, which might have made it to page 3 in Haaretz and page 7 in the New York Times with a half-inch mention. We sometimes hear of extraordinary stories, particularly attached to the activities of Sheikh Raed Salah, again a local activity, the head of the northern branch of the Islamic movement in Israel, who's been involved in rather astounding efforts, for example, to bring waters from the Zamzam spring in Mecca, from the Holy Mosque in Mecca, to the Temple Mount to fill up some 30 different areas which would contain water from the Zamzam River and therefore elevate its holiness to the Islamic world. Those efforts were thwarted, and therefore they never, while they get mentioned, while they're referred to, while we know of them, they're not putting the fight for Jerusalem center stage. I think my first sense that this issue has to be tackled and dealt with, and it has to be tackled in a timely fashion, goes back to the period where I served at the United Nations back in the latter part of the 1990s. You might remember there was a very intense month in March 1999 where at the time Israel was entering into a struggle with the European Union over the visits of various European ambassadors to come to Orient House to meet with representatives of the Palestinian Authority, particularly with Faisal Husseini at the time, who had the file for Jerusalem at the PA. Those visits constituted a violation of the Oslo agreements themselves, which clarified that during the interim period, Jerusalem was supposed to be under full Israeli sovereignty, and that perhaps there would be a discussion for negotiation in the future. But at present, any governmental activity by the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem was a violation of the agreement. When Israel put forward its frustration with these continuing European visits in the Orient House, the European Union suddenly responded very forcefully. And all of a sudden, the Israeli Foreign Ministry receives what's called a note verbal. I love these oxymorons that sometimes come up in diplomatic language. It's like the word non-paper. You know, it's a paper, what do you do? But anyway, there was something called a note verbal, which was a way of indicating to the State of Israel their dissatisfaction with the positions we were taking on those Orient House visits. And in that note verbal was a very surprising sentence. It said the European Union reaffirms its known position concerning the specific status of Jerusalem as a corpus separatum, close quotation. Corpus separatum. So anybody who's taken the Introduction to Middle East Studies course remembers UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which called for a partition of the Palestine Mandate into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And in the area of Jerusalem came up with this concept of a corpus separatum, an internationalized Jerusalem under UN rule. And this arrangement was supposed to last for 10 years. And then there'd be a vote of the residents of Jerusalem what they wanted to do. They wanted to attach themselves to the Arab state, to Israel, or continue the corpus separatum. Because we had such a massive Jewish majority at the time, perhaps the young Israeli leadership swallowed the idea of the corpus separatum back in '47, the young Jewish leadership at the time, and we accepted it. But things had changed. And now the year wasn't 1947 or 1948 or 1949. The year was 1999, more than 50 years later. And we had to discuss with the European Union internationalization of Jerusalem. This was the position being put forward. This immediately had an impact on Palestinian diplomatic positions. Within 2 weeks, Abu Allah gave an interview in El Ayam, one of the two official Palestinian Authority newspapers, and made the astounding statement, well, according to the European Union, both East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem are occupied territory. Suddenly, the parameters of what we are negotiating over expanded. I started feeling this rather quickly at the United Nations because we suddenly saw that the Palestinian observer, Nasser al-Kidwai, was putting out official UN documents, documents of his own mission, but they're circulated in the UN as UN documents, echoing this new position about Resolution 181, that would be the basis of the peace process. And in fact, al-Kidwai wrote the following quote in one of these documents. It was a letter to Secretary General Kofi Annan at the time. Israel must still explain to the international community the measures it took illegally to extend its laws and regulations to the territory it occupied in the War of 1948, beyond the territory allocated to the Jewish state in Resolution 181. So we were now struggling over the 1947 borders from the statement of al-Kidwai. I had to know how to act. Jerusalem, again, had been off the radar screen, the Orient House visits notwithstanding. And normally when you serve as an ambassador of any country, but of the State of Israel in particular, it looks like when you're giving those speeches in the UN that, you're the one thinking of everything and coming up with all the great phraseology, but actually you are operating with a lot of assistance from the home base in Jerusalem. And there's a man behind the curtain who's helping you. And usually it's the legal department of the foreign ministry, and I owe a lot to Daniel Taub in those years for that assistance. But in this case, the foreign ministry said, on an issue of such historical importance, such as the status of Resolution 181, the old partition plan from 1947, and what happens to Jerusalem, we're going beyond the legal department of the Israeli foreign ministry. Get on the phone to the foreign minister, who at that time was Ariel Sharon. So we had several talks about this subject, and Sharon had made a decision to base the response of the State of Israel to this growing predicament that we were facing in the following manner. By the way, I had also alerted him to the fact that when al-Kidwai had put out his letter in 1999 at the UN, Yasser Arafat was in New York. Yasser Arafat, in fact, was visiting with Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, came out to do a stakeout in front of the press in Arabic. We sent somebody to listen to what he was saying. Again, he was talking about 181. This was a serious problem. This was not a local development. So what Sharon did is Sharon looked into the old books. And he came up with the formal statement of our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, to the same problem. What is the status of Resolution 181 and its implications for Jerusalem? And what, at the time, Ben-Gurion said, he said it in the Knesset in December 1949, he explained that the UN had failed to implement its own resolution, that Jerusalem had been under siege, the old city had been bombed, the UN did nothing to break the siege of Jerusalem. The nascent Israel Defense Forces came to save the Jewish community in Jerusalem from certain annihilation. And while Ben-Gurion recognized that 181 was still on the books and a valid UN resolution, he stated the following, quote, "We can no longer regard the United Nations resolution on the 29th of November as having any moral force. We regard the resolution of the 29th of November concerning Jerusalem to be null and void." So Ben-Gurion clarified that internationalization was not going to be an option back in 1949, and we restated the same position in the year 1999, 50 years later. The reason I'm telling you this story is because it shows that in a very short period of time, between March 1st of 1999 and about March 23rd, from Jerusalem being basically off the radar screens, it suddenly was on. And there were positions we had to think about that we hadn't thought about in 50 years. Those positions were in some policy planning documents of European countries. They were maybe even being discussed in quiet meetings in various capitals in Europe or in the Middle East. But they were off the radar screen. And so we could happily go along assuming that everything was just fine. And suddenly an incident occurs, which begins with that famous note verbal, and we have a very serious problem on our hands. So what I would like to share with you is my perception, and this is the reason really why I wrote The Fight for Jerusalem, is that there are many undercurrents out there today that are affecting the future struggle of Jerusalem. They may not be visible, they may be underwater, but they can all of a sudden burst forward, and we have to be prepared for them. Some of those undercurrents are very positive. Some of the positions that we've enjoyed in the international community are good for Israel, although many of those good ones have been forgotten. But there are also other forms of argumentation out there that I believe I should share with you. What I'm going to do this evening is really divide my words into three parts. In the first part, I want to deal with what are the strong points in Israel's defense on Jerusalem. In particular, I want to look at the international legal aspects of the Jerusalem issue in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. We are now commemorating 40 years since the Six-Day War and the reunification of Jerusalem. Second of all, I want to fast forward from that point to the diplomatic dimension of the issue of Jerusalem, particularly after the second Camp David meeting, the one held that did not produce an agreement, but produced the first suggestions to redivide Jerusalem in July of 2000. What's the legacy of that second Camp David conference, and how does it influence things today as we face this issue in the future? And third, I think it's impossible to discuss the future of Jerusalem without a third subject. And that third subject is how what in the world community today is called the global war on terrorism affects the future of the Jerusalem issue and how the Jerusalem question might be addressed. First, let me start with this international legal aspect, which I said before is probably an area where Israel has very important, strong points that have been forgotten. You might remember on June 7th, 1967, the Israeli army captured the old city of Jerusalem. An historic moment occurred in Jewish history and the history of Israel. But it immediately raised the question of what should happen when the war was over. How did Israel actually enter into hostilities along the front with the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan? Over the question of Egypt, much has been written and much has been discussed. We had faced three threats to the south: the massing of forces, the removal of the United Nations emergency force, the closure of the Straits of Tiran. One could make the argument that a state of war already existed between Israel and Egypt prior to Israel's preemptive strike, although international lawyers might debate that because the actual closure of the Straits of Tiran wasn't tested. But leaving that aside, on the Jordanian front, the situation had been rather clear. Israel faced the opening of hostilities from the fully mobilized Jordanian army sitting in the West Bank. Artillery was striking into the western part of Jerusalem. Hundreds of buildings had been damaged. And Israel sent repeated messages before its forces went into action to the Hashemite Jordanian leadership to halt and that nothing would happen to Jordan. At least 2 messages were sent through the UN. But of course, the hostilities persisted, and Israel, as a result, moved into Jerusalem, capturing the old city and reunifying it. Now, those circumstances were very important because they clearly established that Israel entered into Jerusalem, into the eastern parts of Jerusalem, into the old city, in a war of self-defense. Not in a preemptive strike, not in a war of aggression like in other countries, but in a war of self-defense. And that immediately changed the nature of the discussion that would follow in the months afterwards in the United Nations about what would have to happen, how this conflict would be resolved. For example, the Soviet Union recognized early on that if Israel was identified as having entered into these territories in a war of self-defense, it would be very hard for the USSR to defend its Arab clients. For that reason, the Soviet mission to the UN was active, first in the Security Council, to have Israel branded as the aggressor in the Six-Day War. The Soviets lost in a vote in the Security Council, 11-4. Then they went to what should have been their home stadium, the General Assembly. And you would think to have Israel branded anything in the General Assembly would be, from another context, a slam dunk. It wasn't. In fact, in the General Assembly, the Soviet Union lost in an effort to have Israel branded as the aggressor, 36-80. Now, what does that mean? That means the international community implicitly understood that Israel was acting out of self-defense, that it hadn't just woken up one day and said, you know what, it would be nice to be a wider country. Being thin is not such a great idea. Being 8 miles wide at Netanya is intolerable. No. The only reason Israel moved into the West Bank and into Jerusalem was out of a war of self-defense. And this led to several clear diplomatic and legal consequences. First of all, it led to the language that emerged in the most important UN resolution that would affect the peace process for decades. UN Security Council Resolution 242, which was adopted in November of 1967, several months after the Six-Day War. And there were 3 important aspects to that resolution that are worth spending some time on. One, there was no effort in that resolution to restore the pre-war situation. You know, many times in conflict resolution, you have a war, everyone sits down, they say, well, let's restore the status quo ante, the Latin term for the previous situation. That didn't happen. There was no call for a full Israeli withdrawal from those territories. Everybody at some point has studied that famous withdrawal clause in UN Security Council Resolution 242. Sometimes when you discuss the fact that it says withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories and not from all the territories, you seem to many people to be excessively Talmudic, or you're trying to read into a phrase some meaning that really isn't there. That question of whether the withdrawal clause in Resolution 242 should have all the territories, or just withdrawal from territories, wasn't even a subject for legal experts between the British, U.S. missions on the one hand and the Soviet mission on the other hand. That went to the top. That went to the level of direct communications between President Johnson and Alexei Kosygin in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets were pushing for withdrawal from all the territories, both in Moscow and in New York. The U.S. and the British remained firm. So it was an intentional phraseology and not just a happenstance consequence of some careless secretaries who were typing. So as I said before, there was no restoration of the pre-war situation. There's a famous clause in 242 that affects all of this. The clause, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Earlier drafts put out by third world countries focused on this issue and wanted it put into the operative language of resolution, what would become Resolution 242. And to this day, if you sit with Arab diplomats from Syria, from other countries, they'll say to you, there's inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. It's in 242. But everybody who's ever worked on UN resolutions knows there's a huge difference between the preamble of a resolution and its operative paragraphs. And when you're negotiating the language of a UN resolution, one of the things you do in a negotiation when you want to keep an idea in, but basically not give it any legal strength, is you remove it from the operative language and you put it in the preamble. And that's what the US and Britain did. In any case, who wants to acquire territory by war? You want to acquire territory, if you do, as a result of a territorial compromise in negotiations. So the whole clause doesn't even apply anyway. But it became something that some would harp on, and intentionally, it was put into the preambular language. And of course, the famous part of the resolution that spoke about secure and recognized boundaries, which for our discussion today was relevant because it talked about basically that new borders had to be created because the previous ones were neither secure nor were they recognized. Now, the interesting thing about Jerusalem in all of this is that Jerusalem is not mentioned once in UN Security Council Resolution 242. And the one who really pointed that out was the US ambassador at the time to the United Nations, Arthur Goldberg. And Goldberg, in fact, was enraged in the late 1970s, or about in the year actually 1980, because of the positions that the Carter administration was taking on Jerusalem. So he woke up and one day decided to write an article, a letter to the New York Times, explaining that Carter's policies were inconsistent with the original intent behind 242, and that Jerusalem wasn't even mentioned. Now, this raised also a question. If you're going to deal with the issue of Jerusalem, despite the fact it's not mentioned in 242, what do you do? As I said before, the idea of restoring the status quo ante, the previous situation, wasn't contained in the resolution. And if you think about it, restoring the status quo ante, the previous situation, was actually an untenable proposal to make with respect to Jerusalem. Who was the previous occupier sitting in the Old City? The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. How did they get there? Well, they illegally invaded the nascent state of Israel in 1948. I use the word illegal because the UN Secretary General at the time called it an act of aggression. So can you give Jordan rights in Jerusalem that are derived from an initial action that was wrong, that was a violation of international law? It's a problem. It's a serious problem. And what about this previous situation in Jerusalem? If you did not have full religious freedom in Jerusalem, if the Jews couldn't go to the Western Wall, if 55 synagogues and study halls in the Old City had been destroyed, if the tombstones on the Mount of Olives had been desecrated or used for building purposes, even for latrines. So is that what the United Nations would want to restore? It's a difficult question. It didn't make it so simple. And therefore, if you look for the establishing a future of Jerusalem on the basis of, let's turn it back to Jordan in 1967 or 1968, it's not such an easy suggestion to make. What about if you look at the population of Jerusalem? Some people like to contend sovereignty is with the population of a given area. Well, one of the surprising little facts about Jerusalem that nobody knows is when you take Jerusalem together, both parts, you have a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. And it's not a recent development. One of my favorite little findings in my book that I put in the appendix, maybe I should have put it earlier, is a cable written by the British Consul General in Jerusalem in the year 1864. And he there relates his assessment of the population balance in Jerusalem at the time. And there is a clear-cut Jewish majority. When? In the year 1863. In the middle of the 19th century, before the rise of Zionism, before the British Empire gets here, before Balfour. So if you're going to use the residents of Jerusalem as a reference point for international legal rights, well, guess what? We're not in such bad shape. So that obviously couldn't be the clear reference point for moving forward. Going back to that period, which we tend to forget about, and we better remember because the challenge is coming, there's an extremely important article, which I've spoken about many times with Ambassador Rosen, an article by a scholar by the name of Stephen Schwebel, who wrote in the American Journal of International Law in 1970. Now, this is not a reference to an obscure and unimportant journal. It is the leading journal of international law in the United States. Schwebel wrote an article called What Wait to Conquest. It was an article analyzing Resolution 242. For Schwebel, what was important when you look at the claims of the parties in Jerusalem, you have to look at their relative strength. And he made the most, I think, very important and surprising conclusion, and I just took this one sentence from his article from the American Journal of International Law. Israel has better title in the territory of what was Palestine, including the whole of Jerusalem. Now, Schwebel was not working for the Jabotinsky Institute. Schwebel later becomes the legal advisor of the U.S. Department of State. From there, his legal career continues to grow, expand, and he is nominated to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, where he becomes the president of the International Court. That doesn't mean this article has the authority of a decision of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Although legal opinions in legal journals have an influence on the growth of international law. Clearly, back in 1970, given the choices that existed, it was a very reasonable position by not a scholar off from the side, but a mainstream scholar who would later become a major authority in international law, to see that Israel's rights in Jerusalem were the strongest rights that there were. Now, just to bring this part to a close on the issue of international legal rights, as we prepare for the future, it's useful to make a comparison that one should not normally make, but I'm not in government today, and therefore I can talk about it. Years later, in the year 1990, a terrible case of aggression occurred in the Middle East. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. And the United Nations had to go into action and adopt resolutions. And in the case of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, in comparison to Israel's entry into territories under self-defense, the situation was as different as day and night. That was a clear-cut case of aggression, and ours was a case of defending ourselves. As a result, when you take, as just an exercise in international law, the resolutions adopted by the UN Security Council in 1990 and 1991 on the Kuwait crisis, and compare them to 242, you see the huge difference. The resolutions with respect to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait are adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Why Chapter 7? The UN Charter is divided into chapters for different types of international situations. Chapter 7 deals with acts of aggression. And here, the resolutions with respect to Iraq, accordingly, are Chapter 7 resolutions, which are binding international law and can become the basis of military action. What chapter was 242 adopted under? It doesn't say. But it was known to everybody that it was adopted under Chapter 6. Chapter 6 resolutions are not acts of aggression. It's called peaceful resolution of disputes. They require a negotiation to implement. The chapters on the Chapter 7 resolution on Iraq is self-enforcing. How does Iraq implement those resolutions? It gets up one day and it leaves Kuwait. There's no negotiation. How do you implement a Chapter 6 resolution? You have to sit down with the parties and work it out. So it's a completely different situation. And that's why Israel's rights are very different than the rights of a case of an aggressor. And of course, those resolutions on Iraq call for a complete withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwaiti territory. There's no secure and recognized boundaries. There's no flexibility in a withdrawal clause. I'm going into this and I'm making this horrible comparison only because I want to make the point that Israel has international legal rights that are clearly visible when you compare it to the extreme case of Saddam in Kuwait. And those legal rights are rights that we have to keep in mind, even though, again, It's not on our radar screen. No one's arguing with us right now about this, but they're out there, and they're going to come, these issues will come back to us. And therefore, blowing the dust off the books of the American Journal of International Law from 1970 isn't a bad idea. Second of all, when we speak about undercurrents, things that could affect the future of Jerusalem in the future, I just spoke about an issue which, from the way I presented it, certainly shows that Israel has a strong case on the basis of the legacy of the Six-Day War. But there are also more problematic threats that we face out there when this issue returns to us. And in order to understand that, we have to look at the impact of that second Camp David summit. This is the diplomatic legacy of Camp David. You might remember that the Camp David summit, which was held by President Clinton between July 11th and July 24th, 2000, brought together our former Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO and chairman of the Palestinian Authority. And intense negotiations were worked on all the subjects at Camp David. I just saw a recent piece by Aaron David Miller in the Washington Post in which he admitted nothing was bridgeable in this period of time, although there are many revisionist pieces that have come out since then that try and say, with a little more time, a little more effort, and being nice, we could have closed the deal. The significant aspect of Camp David is that Jerusalem was not put into a side letter like the first Camp David. It was actually discussed as being the heart of the agreement. That happened because the Oslo agreements in 1993 veered away from traditional Israeli policy and for the first time put Jerusalem up as an issue for negotiations. Faisal Husseini commented at the time in the mid-90s, if you make an issue a subject of negotiations, you're making the first step towards making a concession. Yitzhak Rabin, despite that concession, strongly believed in keeping Jerusalem united. And so he didn't get into the issue, well, it's now negotiable, therefore that's the beginning of our pulling back in Jerusalem. He didn't think that way. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he understood his own conviction on the issue. But it's interesting and important to read Rabin's last speech in the Knesset 1 month before he's assassinated. He was assassinated in November of 2005. In October of 2005, 1995. He was assassinated, I said, in November of 1995. In October of 1995, he gave his last speech in the Knesset. It was an important speech because, eerily enough, what Rabin did is he outlined his version of what Israel's ultimate borders should be in a political settlement with the Palestinians. I'm not going to go into all that with the Jordan Valley and other points that he spoke about. But what was clear in Rabin's parting speech was that Jerusalem must remain united under the sovereignty of Israel. So you had an irony in his position. On the one hand, he was willing to make it a negotiable subject, but he felt that when he would come to those negotiations, he would not divide the city. When we now fast forward to Camp David in July of 2000, Prime Minister Barak takes a different approach. And he's willing to consider proposals for not just dividing Jerusalem, but dividing the old city itself. And as you move along a period of time from the first Camp David, those first Camp David meetings in July of 2000, to the Taba talks, to the proposals of President Clinton made just weeks before President George W. Bush is sworn in, what you see is a clear deterioration of Israel's position and more concessions made on the issue of Jerusalem. Now, I'm not going to go into those details here, but there's something else that emerged in Camp David that requires special attention. Because towards the end of Camp David, going beyond the issues of normally international law and concern with international diplomacy, Arafat turns to President Clinton and to the other negotiators and says, when the issue of Jerusalem comes up, that there never was a temple in Jerusalem. An astounding claim. It goes through several variations. At one point in an interview in a newspaper, Arabic newspaper, he says, the temple was in Nablus. Later he said, no, it was in Yemen. And he tries to explain the Queen of Sheba and Solomon through a temple being in Yemen. Now, anyone who's ever worked with Arafat understands that he uses and used diplomatic techniques of throwing out absurdities to sort of shuffle the cards in a new way and maybe gain an advantage. But what happened was that Arafat basically began a whole school of thought at that moment at Camp David, the school of thought of temple denial. And it wasn't just confined to him, because he's gone. And it wasn't a short-term tactical issue, because he repeated it. In fact, most of the Palestinian leaders, who many of us are familiar with, from CNN, from interviews on Fox, from the Israeli media, began to adhere to this new doctrine of temple denial. Nabil Shah spoke about the fictitious temple, Nabil Shah from Wharton. He said so in El Ayam, one of the Palestinian newspapers. Saeb Erekat also engaged temple denial. Yasser Abed Rabbo spoke to Le Monde, engaging in temple denial. Yasser Abed Rabbo from the Geneva Initiative, someone who's always been considered a moderate person that you could speak to. And last but not least, and unfortunately, and I say this out of more regret than anything else, is Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. August 25th, 2000, a short time after Camp David, also makes the same claim of temple denial. In fact, what I noticed is that what Arafat had basically done at Camp David is he had thrown a rock into a lake, and the ripple effect started spreading across the Arab world. And suddenly you see, in the years after Camp David, seminars held in the United Arab Emirates talking about temple denial. Imagine they were well budgeted. Unfortunately, even our neighbor to the east, some of its universities, Yarmouk University, holds a seminar on temple denial and invites Europeans, because there is a whole European school of thought that's also very skeptical about the veracity of anything in the Old Testament. And a kind of unholy alliance is made between some of these European visitors and those who are advocating temple denial in the Arab world. When I was looking at this, and this really grabbed my attention as I was preparing my book, I met with an Islamic scholar in England, I'll leave unnamed for now, who really understands both Quran and the commentaries of the Quran very well. And he was outraged at what was happening. He was telling me that many of his clients in the Gulf states, in Saudi Arabia, not only don't believe there was a temple, they don't believe there was a kingdom of Israel or a kingdom of Judah. That the whole thing was a fabrication. So the ripples of temple denial started spreading into whole other areas. You started seeing also serious institutions begin to host those who were moving in this kind of intellectual direction. I mean, I'm a product of Columbia University. There's a professor at Barnard College named Nadia Abu al-Hajj, who wrote a book with University of Chicago Press. She has great phrases in that book, such, and I say that facetiously, like the temple was a national historical tale. And much of the research on archaeology in Israel is, quote, pure political fabrications, unquote. So this is not just something that happens at Camp David. It's not just something that spills over into Jordan or into the Gulf states. It starts hitting academia. And it doesn't seem like anybody's really doing anything about it. Clearly, what this move did, this what I call in the book temple denial, and this particular legacy from Camp David, it involved crossing a red line in our future negotiations with the Palestinians. And in terms of legacies, it will make it much more difficult. Because the heart of any peace process is the action, is the move of mutual recognition, the legitimacy of another people. And if you begin to deny the most fundamental aspects of a nation's history aggressively, then what are you left with in terms of mutual recognition? In fact, the whole issue of denials, Holocaust denial by Ahmadinejad, and in this case temple denial, are dealing with two pillars of the rise of modern Israel. Last, I have to tell you, and I don't want to mention names, I have even heard and seen Jordanian diplomats sometimes put into an awkward position where they're asked about temple denial. And instead of saying, oh, this is ridiculous, they sort of don't know what to say. Because if they say it's not true, they may be in trouble with the Palestinians. And if they say it is true, they look awkward in front of a Western audience. So it's like a little virus that starts spreading all over the region. And in my judgment, it's a very dangerous one because it gets it to the heart of what peacemaking is about. So when we speak about undercurrents, I mentioned the positive undercurrents of our legal position, but there's the negative undercurrent of this temple denial process, which I deal with extensively in my book. I would like to also deal with a third aspect of when we talk about undercurrents affecting the issue of Jerusalem, and that is the current global war on terrorism. In the final chapter of my book, I actually stress this as an undercurrent which is out there, which, again, I believe can easily burst forward. And one of the best indicators of it is what happened right after President George W. Bush was reelected in 2004. Tony Blair, Prime Minister of Great Britain, decides to send a message of congratulations. That's what you would normally do. And instead of just doing a kind of matter-of-fact, congratulations on your electoral victory, let's hope we can work together, Blair somehow all of a sudden makes a public statement that now we can get to deal with the most dangerous crisis in the world today, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I looked at that and I said, wait a minute, what is going on here? How can he make that assertion? I mean, isn't Iran trying to achieve nuclear weapons? Perhaps a more dangerous crisis? Isn't the residual capability of al-Qaeda on the Afghan-Pakistani border, particularly for a country like Great Britain that faces a terrorist problem linked to that part of the world, isn't that the urgent problem that Great Britain must deal with? I mean, certainly they have an interest in the peace process, that's fair. But the most urgent problem in the world? And this opened up, for me, the idea that there is a perception that exists among, in the elite parts of the diplomatic community, that if you want to address the rage of radical Islam, first and foremost, you have to push for a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and ultimately, a solution over Jerusalem. This appears in one place after another. Of course, European writers speak about this. Recently, President Clinton made an appearance in the United States, which was reported in the New York Sun. He said the same thing. There was the famous head of counterterrorism during the Clinton administration in the National Security Council, Richard Clarke, makes the same assertion in his book. And if this is the wedge issue for going into the issue of Jerusalem, it's a very dangerous assumption that has to be very carefully examined, critically examined. As someone who's written on the subject, and you'll see it in my book, I reach a very opposite conclusion. If we look at when, for example, al-Qaeda was it formed in response to anything in Jerusalem? Was al-Qaeda, in fact, created in the aftermath of a single Arab-Israeli war in 1948? 1967, 1973, 82. No. Al-Qaeda, which after all is the leading sword of radical Islam on the Sunni side today, was formed in Afghanistan. And when? In 1989. What happened in 1989? Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. And in the aftermath of that withdrawal, the founding fathers of al-Qaeda sensed an enormous victory. They had beaten a superpower, and they could replicate the victories of early Islam now at the end of the 20th century. And where was Jerusalem in all of this calculation? Well, the most important people affecting the growth of radical Islamic ideology in the Sunni side were first Abdullah Azzam, the Palestinian teacher of Osama bin Laden, who came out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. Originally, he's from the area of Jenin. And Azzam wrote a book, From Kabul to Jerusalem. And the argument he made was that first you have to go on the jihad, the great jihad in Afghanistan, and only then can you deal with the issue of Jerusalem. Abdullah Azzam was killed by a car bomb in 1989. And the chief ideologue that essentially replaces him for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda was Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, what does he say about Jerusalem? He wrote essays in 1995, particularly one essay, which talks about that the road to Jerusalem goes through Cairo. And his view was that before the Islamic world could take Jerusalem, what it had to do was topple the regimes of the Arab world. So it wasn't that Jerusalem was unimportant in the radical Islamic world. It was that it was a matter of an order of priorities. There were other things that had to happen first, other battlefields that had to be engaged first. Now, this is very important because when you look at the history of the 1990s, as Jerusalem increasingly comes on the negotiating table, and as the West, led by the United States, is engaging in Arab-Israeli diplomacy, what happens? You remember that the first Oslo Agreement, signed in September of 1993. Heavy American involvement in the peace process follows. We have the Gaza-Jericho Agreement in 1994. Between our efforts to move the peace process forward, which should happen, and the war against radical Islam and al-Qaeda. But nonetheless, the push to deal with our issue continues. In fact, that is the irony of the situation we're in today. I mean, are there any ripe negotiating options between us and the Palestinians on the horizon? But yet, the international community continues to be engaged in this issue. Is it because with some clever diplomacy, somehow we will conclude an agreement within 2 to 3 months with somebody? Or is it because those who are engaged in this process believe that there will be an impact, a positive impact, on the war on terrorism by them moving us inches along towards a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital? Unfortunately, I think that this idea that somehow negotiations over Jerusalem will move us in a direction that will make the regional environment less conducive for the growth of radical Islam and al-Qaeda has captured the imagination of many people. But it doesn't always work that way. The Gaza withdrawal, the Gaza disengagement, it was hoped that by pulling back from that territory, we would lower the flames of the rage of al-Qaeda or radical Islam in the region. And of course, what happened is after we pulled out, Hamas wins the Palestinian elections, and even Abu Mazen admits in an interview in El Hayat that cells of al-Qaeda moved into the Gaza Strip. So the exact opposite occurred from what international expectations were from our forthcoming move. Now, these undercurrents I've described to you, Israel's international legal rights, that really emerged strongest right after the Six-Day War. The question of the legacy of temple denial, which not only is confined to the Middle East, but has little tentacles moving into academia in Western universities. And the third, these assumptions about the efficacy of moving Israel along to making certain concessions for the war on terrorism. These are still undercurrents. These are still sort of underwater. But are they about to burst forward in the same way that I had to experience in March 1999 when I was dealing with suddenly the partition plan, internationalization of Jerusalem coming on the agenda of the UN? The answer is there is a dangerous possibility that this will happen soon. And the key to understanding that is to read the small print in what's called the Saudi Peace Plan. Because the Saudi Peace Plan, which has now been adopted by the Arab League in a different variation, essentially offers us full withdrawal to the pre-67 lines in exchange for normal relations with the Arab world, not normalization, and this isn't the place to go into the difference. If indeed the United States and friendly Western states embrace the Saudi peace plan, let it be clear that that involves putting Jerusalem on the negotiating table. Is Israel equipped to deal with that moment when it comes? Unfortunately, at present, it doesn't look like we're in a position to do so. Most of the diplomatic statements coming out of Jerusalem with respect to the Saudi peace plan relate to the question of the right of return, or the claim of return, as we sometimes call it, which is a serious issue. But nobody seriously is going to allow masses of Palestinian refugees into Israel anyway. You don't see a clear message about other vital issues that are affected by that peace plan. I don't believe that we should, duck under the table when a serious offer comes from the Arab world. I think we have to test it. But the way to test any kind of peace proposal that's being made is to take their peace plan and to put forward our peace plan and say, let's talk and let's see where this goes. Since taking over the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, I've strongly felt that we have a need to talk more openly to the world about issues of substance. It's not enough for the Palestinian side to say, yes, we want a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, and Israel to come forward with a very desirable goal, but it's an abstract goal, peace. And the world doesn't know what we're looking for. And therefore, beyond the issue of defensible borders, which we've dealt with and spoken about, not only in Israel, but in various capitals in the world, I believe now is the time to put forward our claim to a united Jerusalem. Because the bottom line of this book is that if the international community cares about keeping Jerusalem as an open city for all faiths, only a free and democratic Israel can protect Jerusalem for all religions. That is what the lesson of modern history has shown, if we go back prior to the '67 war or we go centuries earlier. And that's a case I try and make in my book, The Fight for Jerusalem. There's a lot more subtleties to that argument. And it's a case I hope the government of Israel will make in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.